In this case, public shaming is supposed to make transgressors feel remorse and change their behavior. These people are not doing that out of their own free will. They have been told, convicted, it's part of their penalty that a judge imposed on them to stand there and describe why they have been convicted, what they have done bad. As the criminologist John Braithwaite points out, the goal of such shame sanctions is not to stigmatize perpetrators and to seek revenge. On the contrary, the aim is to reintegrate perpetrators in decent society through a process of confrontation and exposure. Braithwaite calls this reintegrative shaming. In Europe, such late modern state-prescribed shaming sanctions find little support. Even in the US, there are critical voices from liberals such as Martha Nussbaum, a famous philosopher from Chicago, who demands that the state protect the dignity of every human being, including criminals. In their view, shame sanctions deliberately violate this dignity. In a similar vein, the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, in his 1996 book on the decent society, argues that a decent society is one in which, quote, no one is degraded and humiliated, or whose self-esteem is violated. Margalit here formulates a claim that turns the relationship between decency and shame on its head. The difference between the two camps lies in their perspectives. Liberals focus on individuals and their human dignity, while the opposition, from Plato to humanitarians, present-day humanitarians, focuses on the state or society and its very needs. This controversy between, we would today say, the liberal camp and the humanitarian camp, this controversy actually started in the late 18th and early 19th century. Its first bone of contention was the pillory, the public exposure of people who had violated collectively binding norms. The pillory existed in two versions. In a figurative sense, as a reprimanding process organized by a local community, and in the literal sense, as a punishment tool used by legal authorities. Research on the early modern period has taught us a lot about collective shaming practices. The aim was to publicly humiliate those who had acted against customary rules of conduct, as in the notorious English Skimmington Ride, where wives who beat their husbands, and sometimes also the beaten husbands, were forced to sit backwards on a donkey and paraded through town to the mockery and laughter of the public. Such shaming rituals were encountered everywhere in Europe. Their function was to defend the local moral economy against violations. Violators could be women who were pregnant out of wedlock, but also members of the local magistrate whose orders clashed with people's sense of justice. In contrast to these communal practices, the actual pillory was an official punishment instrument which had much in common with the medieval and early modern church penance. Here you see Daniel Defoe, whom we probably all know as the author of Robinson Crusoe. In 1702, Defoe published anonymously a satirical pamphlet that offended not only the Anglican Church, but also secular authorities. The latter felt forced to act and sentenced Defoe to a hefty fine and time in prison. Additionally, he was pilloried in London for 3 days in July 1703. Normally, public exposure was extremely embarrassing for those who had to endure it and who were subjected to the comments and actions of spectators and passers-by. The public could and did throw rotten eggs and excrement, ridiculing and insulting the offenders. Such behavior clearly played into the hands of the authorities that used the pillory as a deterrent and as a means of social cohesion. Deterrence of those who might be contemplating a similar act, and cohesion among those whose moral economy was asserted and strengthened through the public humiliation of the transgressors, and who consequently endorsed the actions of the authorities. Such endorsement, however, was no longer automatically to be expected by the 18th century. There were excesses in both directions. Either the public turned against the authority, as in Defoe's case. His many friends and supporters managed to shift the mood by distributing copies of the incriminating pamphlet and a poem that Defoe had written especially for the occasion, a hymn to the pillory. Merrily, the onlookers drank to Defoe's health and decorated the pillory with flowers. That was one option, one excess. The other one occurred when the public humiliation, as it often did, turned into a spectacle of violence and retaliation and revenge, as in the case of 2 Londoners charged with homosexuality in 1780. The pilloried men were seriously injured when the public threw stones at them. In the House of Commons, Edmund Burke sharply criticized the transformation of the pillory from, as he said, an instrument of reproach and shame to an instrument of death and murder. In order to avoid such excesses, such riots and protests, judicial authorities increasingly refrained from imposing public shame sanctions. But there were also other motives at play. Judges in Salzburg, in Austria, for example, stopped sentencing craftsmen to the shameful exposure at the pillory because the guilds would subsequently expel them once they stood in the pillory. And expelling them from the guilds clashed with financial interests that sought to maintain undisturbed economic activities. Once somebody was expelled from a guild, he could no longer serve his trade and support his family, and actually became the object of poor relief, which was not in the interest of the local community and the state. And those interests were in undisturbed economic activities were shared by people like Frederick II, who in 1756 warned the Prussian courts against declaring criminal as infamous, since a delinquent thereby became a useless member of society, unable to earn his keep in an honest way. The pillory was regarded as degraded a punishment as beating or flogging, which was meted out in public up to the mid-19th century. The humiliation concerned not only the punished person, but also their relatives. In 1760, a woman in London was publicly flogged for theft. Her son, a master mason, pled mercy for his mother, not only for her sake, but above all for his own interest. And I would love to read that to you in a heavy Cockney accent, which unfortunately I can't master. So, but you have to read it aloud in order to understand what it actually meant. Publicly whipped, it being such a great scandal to me in my business, and would go near to be my ruin. That's what it means. We do not know whether the mother of that London mason actually felt ashamed about her punishment and how she would have expressed her feelings. We do, however, have several sources from the late 18th century which show that people who were pilloried did feel humiliated and insulted. Those who could afford it would rather pay a fine, even if they had to sell their last cow. Even ordinary people, who represented the vast majority of the accused and punished, had too much honor in their body. That's the kind of idiomatic expression, honor in their bodies, to be able to tolerate public exposure and the ensuing shame and loss of honor. That was clearly not the case with Sheena Hardin in 2012.